Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion. It's not a straightforward review. It's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up with me on Twitter, you can find me at ILTM Podcast. I'm also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, and we have a Patreon. The show is always free, but if you want to support us on there, you can. That's at patreon.com/I Love That Movie. And if you sign up, you get a weekly bonus episode. It's just me musing about everything else I'm watching. People ask me about more current movies and shows that I don't get to cover on here. So that's all on the Patreon. We have a lot of great interviews on there too, where we talk about, like, we've discussed WandaVision, The Mandalorian, and several other shows. So yeah, we have fun on there. And I want to take a moment and thank my top patrons. They are Chris Balga, Jeff Widman, Philip Barker, Michael Cross, and Josh Johnson. Thank you guys so much for keeping the lights on. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe and rate the show. It does help new listeners find us. So I have a returning guest. I have Zaki Hasan from the MovieFilm Podcast.
Hello.
Hello, welcome back.
Thanks so much.
Yes, I'm so excited. I feel like, honestly, Zaki, the first time I had you on, I was so nervous because I'm such a fan of your podcast. So if you could
Oh,
talk
wow.
a
Thank
little
you.
bit about your show for people that haven't heard you on here before.
So I am fortunate enough to co-host the MovieFilm Podcast with my partner Brian Hall. That's MovieFilm, one word. And we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary of doing that show.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
I don't know how many total episodes that would be, including commentary tracks and whatnot, but got to be pushing up against 400 once you factor in all of those things. And I'm just honestly, I started the show simply as a way to find a reason to talk to my buddy. Because what I found is that as I was getting busier, as I was having children and whatnot, it became harder to just fly down to LA and spend a weekend. So I said, hey, if we start a show, we have a semi-regular appointment to chat, and that's what it started as, and honestly, that's what it still is.
I love it. I mean, I think that's why I like it so much, because you can really feel your friendship through the podcast, and it's just so entertaining to listen to. Love always hearing y'all's takes, and of course, all your reviews as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah. And so I always have the guests pick the movie. So people always say, can you pick this movie, that movie? You know what? You pick it. So Zaki, what movie did you pick to talk about today?
Well, the last time I was on, I think we talked about The Godfather,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I thought, just to kind of stay in that vein, I decided let's do Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
Yes, 1945. So taking it back. And it's right after spooky season, but I mean, it's spooky season forever in my heart, so I don't mind, talking about another horror, this time a comedy horror, which I think we've only covered like a couple on the show, but this is like the best one ever, right? So
If you
it's a
ask
good
me,
one
yeah.
to cover. Yeah. So before we dive in, if you have not seen this movie before, I definitely recommend that our listeners go watch the movie first and then come back, because we will talk spoilers. And I don't do like a before and after spoilers, because it's just going to be, the flow of the conversation. So I would pause here, watch it, and come back. In the first of the Bud Abbott and Lou Costello horror vehicles for Universal Pictures, the comic duo star as railway baggage handlers in northern Florida. When a pair of crates belonging to a House of Horrors museum is mishandled by Wilbur, the museum's director, Mr. McDougal, demands that they deliver them personally so that they can be inspected for insurance purposes. But Lou's friend Chick has grave suspicions. That is the quick synopsis of the film, which isn't really that important, I don't think.
You're right. Yeah.
Anyway, but let's kind of talk about your history with this, Zaki. When did you first see this movie?
So I saw this for the very first time when I was growing up. I lived in Saudi Arabia when I was a kid, and they showed it on TV there. And I was familiar with the Universal monsters because there was a whole set of books. I think they were published by Crestwood that looked at famous movie monsters. So you had an entire book about the Wolfman and Frankenstein and King Kong, Godzilla, etc. So I had checked all of those books out, so I knew them very well. But I had the in terms of the very first time I saw the Universal monsters on screen, it was in this film.
Wow. Okay. So this was like your introduction to the whole, I guess, the first cinematic universe, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's really cool. I don't think I've seen this movie before.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, this is my first time, so I was excited. I'm glad that you picked it, and I don't know why I haven't seen this before. I've seen some of the other like Universal Pictures, horror movies, but I haven't seen this particular film. So yeah,
Wow. So
I,
that
I
kind
don't
of
have
worked
like
out.
a fun story. Yeah, that's it. This time, I love it when that happens though. When someone picks a movie I haven't seen yet, it's almost always a movie that I've been wanting to see, and so it just kind of goes along with that. But let's share. I'm going to share a couple quick facts, and then we'll kind of dive more into the movie. So, fact number one: the animation sequences of Dracula as a bat and Dracula changing from a bat to Dracula were done by Universal International's animator Walter Lantz, who worked on Woody Woodpecker. So yeah. uh, let's see. So my other quick fact that I had was that according to the DVD's audio commentary by film historian Gregory W. Mank, this was the second cheapest film made by Universal International in 1948, and it became the studio's second highest grossing film of that year.
And it spawned a whole new mini franchise for them.
Yeah, yeah. I said 1945 earlier, so I meant 48 clearly. But yeah, so that's all I have for quick facts. Did you have any that you wanted to share?
Well, I think one thing worth mentioning is that this is the only the second time Bela Lugosi played Dracula, and
Yeah.
it tells you something about how how much of an impact he made in the role with just one movie, that we just so completely associate him with that character. And yet in all the other times that Dracula appeared in these, either in the sequel Son of Dracula, or in all these Monster Jam movies, it was never Lugosi. And the one time he came back was in uh, I was going to say parody, that's not right, but in a comedy romp.
Mhm. Yeah. I always get kind of bummed when I think about him, and I think it's only because of that Ed Wood movie.
That's right.
I mean, and there is kind of like some sadness. I mean, when you read about like what was happening like during the time of filming of this, and like this is his last time on screen as the character in addition to being the second time and all that, but I don't know, I almost feel closer to that actor than I would without that Ed Wood movie, so I
Yeah.
always think about him. And yeah, that's true. Do you want to talk a little bit about the cast?
Well, I think what's so great about this film, it's what I appreciated as a kid, and I continue to appreciate, is that it's meant to exist within the world of the Universal monster. So they brought
True.
back all of those actors. I mean,
Mhm.
it's not like, oh, it's Schmenkenstein's monster. Wink, wink.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's something that makes the movie work. It's that is Lon Chaney as Talbot back again. There's Glenn
Right.
Strange back as the monster. There's Lugosi, of course. And it adds this sense of Bud and Lou moving in and out of this movie. But it's funny because Chaney when he talked about this film, he said, "Oh, I think that movie made the monsters into buffoons," and I push back on that because I think what I love about this is that it's another one of the Monster Mash movies, no different than House of Dracula or House of Frankenstein, but it happens to have Bud and Lou weaving in and out of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think some of the movies afterwards that they did
Right.
with monsters kind of lean more into the goofiness from what I read. But this particular one is more like a love letter uh,
Yeah.
to those films. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, like this one and Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man are both like even Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man. That is in essence just another Invisible Man sequel,
Uh,
and it exists within the world of the earlier films. The Claude Rains character, Jack Griffin, like it's part of those.
hmm.
And I think that's why Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and Meet the Invisible Man. That's why they work. I think once they got to the Mummy, as you said, like it became more arch and it became a parody.
Hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
that's the trick, like the modern comparison I make is something like Shaun of the Dead, right?
Hmm.
Which is obviously far more grotesque, but you never you laugh at Sean and Ed and everything, but you never don't take the threat of the zombies seriously.
Right. Yeah, I was reading an article that was saying that that's how you do a horror comedy is that, you have the two comedians, but the other actors have to take their roles really seriously. So like, all the other characters are playing it so straight, um, and so dedicated, and that's kind of where some of the humor comes from. Otherwise, if everyone's being goofy, like you said, it kind of takes you out of it.
That's right.
Well, did you want to talk a little bit about some of your favorite scenes from the film?
Oh my gosh. Well, I
Every
think
film? Every scene?
so many. I mean, it continues to crack me up, and I think what makes it extra funny is how not into it Abbott and Costello were.
Yeah, you mean behind the scenes, yeah.
Yeah, like they're like, I don't know, this is a bad idea. We're not feeling it. And yet all these decades later, it cracks you up. I watch it, I laugh. My kids watch it, they laugh. I think there's a couple of scenes that I always think of. The one um, where Lou is he comes into Talbot's room after
Mhm.
Talbot has turned into the Wolfman, and so you've got the Wolfman sort of creeping around at the edges of the frame as Lou is just kind of moving through and eating an apple or whatever. Uh, and again, it's what's so great is Lon Chaney as Talbot and the Wolfman. He by far he's my favorite of the Universal monsters.
I have to agree. I saw that movie for the show,
Oh, okay.
and it was like the first time I'd ever really sat down and watched it. I know, like what was up with my parenting, right? Like I never saw these growing up. But anyway, I watched it and I was really struck by how sincere
Yeah,
and moving his performance is. I think drawing a lot from his own personal life, and just you can just really feel that. And even in this movie, I read same thing. It's like you can tell he's going through a lot and it really adds to the character. I think you could compare like his struggles with addiction kind of to, turning into the Wolfman and stuff like that. It's just I don't know, it just really I was really amazed by how much I liked that film, and I think it's probably my favorite.
I mean so much of it is Lon Chaney, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Just the pathos, right? Like, if we're talking about the Wolfman, I mean, the way that film ends, where Sir
Yeah.
John Talbot ends up killing his own son, he doesn't realize it. I mean, it's this gothic tragedy, right?
Mhm.
And what I like is that for every time Cheney brought Talbot back, he kept that thread of pathos throughout, up to and
Yeah.
including Abbott and Costello. Like
Mm.
he's playing the same guy. That's what makes it so cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true because I think sometimes over time with characters, they can evolve so much that they're nothing like what they used to be. And you're right, he stays so consistent like throughout.
Yeah, and Cheney, he said in when discussing the Wolfman, he said that's my baby because no one else played him. But
Yeah, that's true.
he played every other character at some point. He played the monster.
Right.
He played Dracula. He played the mummy. And so I think definitely that through line really helps. But I also like that Talbot is the good guy. He's the one
Yes,
who's
that's
with Bud
true.
and Lou. Like um, the way they set it up in the film, it totally works. Of course,
Hmm.
Dracula's the villain. Of course, the monster's caught in the middle. It works. Like I was saying earlier, you take Bud and Lou out, you've still got a great Monster Mash movie.
That's true. I completely agree. And I like the whole, like, it starts out with well, I don't know. There's something really funny to me about the whole movie being in Florida. Like, I think at some point during the film you kind of forget about that because there's like a castle and Dracula lives in Florida. Like, but anyway, like I think it's funny that Chick and Wilbur are just baggage handlers, and and then they are transporting these boxes to a wax museum. Like, I mean, how else do you get all these characters in one place? The wax museum is like a perfect way to do that. And also, I think it's, wax museums are like creepy, and like, I don't know, I just kind of like
Yep,
the way that they
it's
set that
perfect.
up, for sure. Yeah, perfect, like you said.
A- And the bit in the beginning, where the candlestick keeps moving on the casket. I mean, that was
Yeah.
something that was from one of their previous films that called Hold That Ghost,
Oh.
I think. And that's what Abbott and Costello would always do. They would kind of repurpose their stage bits or from other movies and put them into new contexts. And it just so happens that probably of their movies, Meet Frankenstein is the one that's been most watched. So they've been immortalized. Those bits have been immortalized thanks to being in this movie.
For sure, there were a lot of jokes that I've heard before that I didn't realize were from this film. Also, there's a joke about describing um, one of the actors, like using like an old cigarette ad, the like tight, fully packed, easy on the draw. I can't remember what part of that, which part of the movie it's in, but that part struck me because I was like, I've heard that joke before, but I didn't realize it was from this movie, and I didn't know it was like based on like a cigarette ad. So,
Right.
pop culture reference of the time in 1948. But I really liked that. And there were just a lot of moments like that where I was like, oh, I've heard that before, and didn't realize it was from this film. But you mentioned earlier that Abbott and Costello weren't really up for this. They didn't really want to do it. They had to be persuaded with a lot of money. But also, I think they were like about to break up too.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how they were very what's the word? I mean, they had uh, a relationship that was very combative.
Yeah, but I
Um,
guess like on screen that's kind of how the relationship is anyway, so it's kind of fine. Like, even though they're at odds with each other in real life, if any of that came through, it comes through the comedy, which, they have a
I,
combative back and forth. So it's fine, I
but I
guess.
think I think in real life, Bud was the more laid back one,
Oh,
and
really? Okay,
I think
interesting.
Lou was more dominant, which kind of makes
Mm,
sense because he would have been the more sort of blustery. You know what I mean? Like the
yeah,
straight man uh, persona makes sense that Lou is like the funny one, right? Even though it's the pairing that makes it work.
right.
Um, but I mean, the fact that after Lou died, like Bud didn't really do much after, right? He voiced himself on like the animated Abbott and Costello show or whatever. Um, but that was it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Were there some other scenes that you wanted to kind of
Oh
chat
well,
through?
the when Lou is trapped in the dungeon, he's got the thing around his neck, and he's trying to um, get the monster's attention,
Hmm.
and he's just crying like. I mean, it's Lou Costello had his big baby persona,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and he knew exactly what note to play to get the biggest laugh. And there's a shortly after he's freed where, and I don't remember the exact setup, but like he's running in one direction, and Bud is like, no, not the right, the other right, and he kind of looks at his hands, and then he runs straight into a wall. I mean,
Yes.
it's just the he subjected himself to a lot of physical punishment because he went for the
Mhm.
laugh. And it was always he was always good for that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this while we're talking about it, and I'm realizing that a lot of my exposure to Abbott and Costello is from like Looney Tunes and people
Oh,
doing
sure.
impressions of them more than I've
Yeah,
actually seen them. So, like, a lot of the jokes and bits that I recognize from this movie, I think I saw in cartoons. I don't
so
think
funny.
I saw from the original, which is kind of funny how
See,
that
I
happens.
think my first exposure to Abbott and Costello was the Abbott and Costello cartoon show that was by, I believe it was
Oh,
by
okay.
Hanna
So
Barbera.
not too far off.
Yeah, so I saw that, and again, it was I was just like, oh, this is cartoon. I didn't realize they were real guys, right? As a kid, you're like, oh my gosh, it's just like that thing that I saw.
Yeah, it's funny sometimes what comes first. Like you said, in a similar way, like you saw this before you saw the other Universal monster pictures, so
Yeah,
kind of lends
and
itself to that. Yeah.
and I think that's part of the reason why I have such an affection for this movie that I bristle when people who study those films or scholars of them say, the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, that one doesn't count. And I'm like, why on earth would it not count?
Ah,
You get
yeah,
Lugosi, you get Cheney, you get Glenn Strange. I mean, it's a continuation of those other films. It's, if anything, it's this nice capstone or epilogue to that era.
for sure. And I think like, for someone like me or you at the time when you saw it, it can introduce you to that whole world, the further that we get away from this time period, it's kind of like I don't know, that just happens with actors and with things that are really popular. The further you get away, like it's like sad, in some ways
Yeah,
people aren't as familiar with Bela Lugosi and Vincent Price and others. And so something like this can be a really easy in point, I think, for people
that's so
to dive
true.
back into it. Yeah.
That's what you say is such a good point, right? Like growing up in the 80s, I was a little kid, but if you showed me a picture of Lugosi, I'd be like, "Oh, that's Dracula." Like before I even saw this movie.
Yeah, yeah.
And and yet to your point, like I don't know that is the case anymore.
Right. Like me, my connection to Abbott and Costello is very thin. I mean, like when I think about things around now, no one come for me if I say like something that's not from the exact right era, but I'm thinking of like when I was younger, I remember seeing I don't know, like The Little Rascals and
Yeah.
like, certain comedic things from that era, but um not so much Abbott and Costello. I saw a little bit of it, but it's like I
Mhm.
don't know, it's just kind of sad. It's like depends on what you're exposed to and I saw this video a while back that said that, and I don't know if this is true, so no one come for me for this either, but it does seem like we're starting to lose some of our pop culture references just because when we were younger, um, there was more on TV. Like we were watching
Yep.
so much TV
Yep.
that was syndicated stuff from a long time ago. And so like
That's right.
I was watching like I Love Lucy and Dick Van Dyke and all kinds of stuff.
Hmm.
And now that's kind of not happening. Now content is constantly being created at such a fast pace
Yeah.
that I don't know that people get that exposure anymore. And it kind of bums me out. Like I don't know what the solution is, but I appreciate stuff like this that was able to keep things in sort of like the pop culture consciousness for way after that era had ended. Like you
Yeah.
said, I think it totally counts.
I mean, what you say is so true. It's something. This is a conversation I have with Brian all the time on our show because we talk about how, like, when we were growing up, weekday afternoon syndication included, Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch and uh,
Yes.
you know, Get Smart and things like, yeah, and like you said, I Love Lucy. The 1960s Batman show, and so even as we were viewing it 20, 30, 40 years after it aired, it was still part of our language.
Hmm.
So if you make a reference to the SS Minnow, we got it. And yeah, to your point, like that's just not the case. I mean, I think my kids, I keep them exposed to things from that vintage, but I, I think I'm outside the norm, right? Like we're right now, my kids and I were going through Quantum Leap, the original Quantum Leap,
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I
and they
love
love
that
it.
show
And
so much.
my 8 year old loves Quantum Leap,
Wow.
so
And I
he's
mean,
like,
that makes
put on
sense
Quantum
when
Leap.
I think about, what my parents exposed me to, it did inform what I liked a lot. So that's really great. But yeah, I don't think there's a lot of kids that are watching Quantum Leap.
That's yeah, that exactly right. Like so, how do these things stay alive? Like uh, I mean, that is sad. I mean, I think it's sad.
A little bit. Like, I don't wanna be one of these people that, like an old person that's like, "I don't like TikTok," and, like, criticizing what's popular, but at the same time, it is kind of a bummer. I think TikTok's done a lot to revive older music. They just need
Sure.
to work on shows and movies next, I guess. But yeah, I think I'm glad that you push back on that idea of this not being a classic because I agree. And I think like when I Google, the movie at least, I pull up a lot of stuff of people defending it. I think because of what you said, they probably connected a lot to it. So that makes sense.
And I think the fact that, because I've watched this one with my kids, and they love it. But I watch it as an adult, and it still cracks me up, right? So I'm like, this is that perfect type of movie that is able to work across generations. Um, and I think part of it too, as I'm talking to you, when you think about it, one of the critiques that I would assume was at the time is that, oh, it renders the monsters not scary, right?
Mhm.
And I think part of where you and I are coming from is like, I don't know that we've ever looked at the Universal monsters as scary per se.
Yeah, I think they're
They're
good stories.
right,
Like,
they're interesting, but
yeah.
like I was never frightened of them, certainly even as a kid.
I think
So
horror can be interpreted in so many different ways. Like, it is a genre, but it's there's a lot of genres within that genre, and I agree. I don't know that the universal monsters are like, I mean, maybe when you're really little you were afraid of them, but I don't think that they're meant to like terrify adults. I think you're meant to be empathetic and interested in the characters.
like when
So I
when
think
you
that
compare the Universal iterations of these characters versus say what Hammer did with them in the UK,
Mhm.
those films are still quite disturbing. So many of them. So
Yeah, that's true.
so it does come down to approach, and I think with that in mind, and I'm not even remotely an expert on the Hammer horror films. My friend Glenn Greenberg he's a Dracula aficionado, so he could
Oh,
he could
nice.
talk your ear off about that. But in fact, I did an episode of the Nostalgia Theater show with him talking about Dracula. Uh, but he's able to differentiate, and it's like you look at Christopher Lee's Dracula versus Bela Lugosi, and you say, well, Lugosi is iconic and interesting, but Christopher Lee is a scary one.
Yeah, I feel like the universal monsters, I would classify them as more like almost like theater,
Yeah,
like more dramatic and fun and big and entertaining.
yeah,
But not necessarily like terrifying. Like, I guess, like when you watch something like Vampire or like Nosferatu, like I think those movies are still genuinely creepy
yeah.
and
I agree.
unsettling, but they don't quite have the same like I mean, they're iconic, but they don't have like the same, like you're saying, the same presence as like Bela Lugosi has as Dracula. Like he's like a fun, I'm gonna dress up at Halloween like Dracula.
Yeah, but it's so
So,
interesting because when you look at Dracula, the 1931 Dracula, um, and compare it with Nosferatu, you say, well, Nosferatu is clearly the better made film.
yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
or, Max Schreck as Count Orlok is clearly the more disturbing vampire. But yeah, I mean, it's just something about what Lugosi did. I mean, what Lugosi did in that film was so good that it made up for the fact that the movie is pretty dull.
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, and it's, I mean, even to this day, like let's say you watch something like What We Do in the Shadows, I feel like the gravitas and the entertainment factor that he brought to that character, I think almost every vampire iteration like pays an homage to that now.
Yeah, it's either an homage or a contrast.
Yeah. Hmm. I think he's probably the character I know the most about. So that's why I'm
Sure.
not talking as much about Frankenstein and the Wolfman, although we talked about them too. I guess let's talk a little bit about Frankenstein then, because we haven't talked about him yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, by this point, Glenn Strange, this was his third time playing the monster,
Oh,
and so we were very far removed from Karloff by this point. Uh,
yeah.
I I think they wanted Karloff to come back for this one. He was like, I'm not gonna. He took the that role very seriously.
Gotcha.
So he was going to have nothing to do with lampooning. I mean, he stepped away after Son of Frankenstein because he was just like all the pathos that had been imbued him with, in the original film and Bride of Frankenstein got drained away. And Son of Frankenstein is not a particularly good movie, but it has Karloff. It's Karloff's last time playing the monster.
Yeah.
So
I would
that's
say
its
go ahead, sorry.
I mean that's its little check mark in history. It's just because of that.
I would say even now, I feel like Hollywood has had a really hard time with the Frankenstein character
Yeah.
in a way that they haven't had a hard time with characters like Dracula, you know?
Hmm.
Like there's something about that story that I don't know why, but they just have a hard time retelling it.
I think it's because, and I do chalk this up to just the iconography of the Boris Karloff slash Jack Pierce depiction of the creature, right?
Mhm.
Uh, I think every just like we were talking about with Lugosi, everything since is either an homage or a contrast, and
Yeah.
I think that the Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, like I don't think it works, not because it's not true to the book, but because that's not the version of Frankenstein people want.
Yeah, I guess you're right. You know, I've thought about it a lot just about the fact that the original story is like the original sci-fi and like
Hmm.
it is such an interesting and dark and just such a good story, but they have such a hard time retelling it. I guess you're right. I guess the way that the character looks is so cemented in our minds that when we veer away from like what the original movie we saw was, it's just too hard to recapture. I don't know. It's like, can't they just make a retelling where they do go full, for I guess for lack of a better word, camp and like do it again? I don't know, but I really like it, and I really want to like it. But yeah,
Yeah,
whenever they try to redo it, I'm just kind of like, I don't know. We
I
want
mean,
this
I
Frankenstein.
I think the character in the book is very verbose, and he has these long monologues where he's very existential. I mean, he's like the Silver Surfer almost, the way he's talking and the
Hmm.
angst of his existence and whatever. And yet, I think the vast majority of people, if they have a concept of the Frankenstein monster at all, it's the like
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
and most people
Very
haven't seen
true.
the film. At this point, we can assume that most people have seen neither Frankenstein nor Bride of Frankenstein, and
I
yet
mean,
that
I've seen him, but I think of like, I think of Mel Brooks Frankenstein, Young
yeah, sure,
Frankenstein.
right.
So
I
that's
mean,
what
they
that's my
they tried to revive the Universal well, they've tried a few times, but Universal tried to do with Van Helsing, uh,
right.
where they did their version of Frankenstein, where he kind of vaguely resembles the Karloff version, but he's very, he's got the stentorian voice, and I mean, audiences rejected that movie.
Yeah, yeah. It just feels like for whatever reason it belongs in that time and looking that specific way in a way that like
Mhm.
some of the other characters don't. But I mean, honestly, to be fair, I think even the Wolfman has some of that going on too. Like I think they've tried a couple times to tell like a newer version of the Wolfman, and it's like, I don't know. I'm not feeling it the way I was the first one, and I don't know, I just think that's kinda interesting that that's the case.
It
So, that's why
it's
they
a
can't revive it.
well, just to pick up on what you're saying about the Wolfman, right? Like the Joe Johnston directed remake from, I think it was 2010. I just revisited that recently, and
Oh, nice.
it's it's interesting because I'm not down on it, but I'm just like it's got all these really interesting pieces, but they don't quite line up.
Hmm.
Because I think Benicio del Toro, who's playing Talbot, I mean, you talk about like just in terms of his appearance, he resembles Lon Chaney Jr.
Agreed, yeah. He's good
Right? So
casting.
you're like, and apparently he was like a huge fan of the Wolfman. So on the one hand, you're like, God, this is perfect, right? And I think the makeup, the Rick Baker makeup to make him look like the Wolfman, it evokes the Chaney version.
Hmm.
But yet the movie just doesn't come together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. So you couldn't remake this movie, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, probably at all?
I don't
You
think so
couldn't
because you
really
need
cast it in modern day.
unless you get Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, and you just do something with them.
That's a good point. It is interesting you said earlier too, like that the comedy still fits. I know that that's always, I mean, that's something we hear at all the time, right? That like, well, they could never make this movie today, or this wouldn't be funny today. And my
Mhm.
answer is usually that comedy evolves. It just does. Like
Yeah,
what's funny today isn't funny tomorrow. It keeps changing, and that's okay. Like that's not a bad thing. It's just what happens. But you can tell when somebody was like truly at their peak and when it was really good when something like this does age pretty well, right? Like it's still
yeah.
funny to us today.
I think it helps that Abbott and Costello's approach to comedy was rooted in absurdism
Mhm.
that sits to one side of whatever the contemporary conversation is.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha. That makes
you know,
sense.
it's just it's nonsense, and nonsense is always funny.
I wonder if
It,
that comes from or go ahead, sorry.
no, no, go ahead.
I was just thinking maybe that comes from so like the way that they got together before, radio and film was they were in burlesque acts, right? Like they
Hmm.
were yeah, like in between sort of commenting on what was actually happening. So they weren't like the main event, they were like commenting on it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like in this movie that's what they're doing. They're like
Yeah,
in the movie and they're the main characters even, but really they're just commenting on everything else that's happening.
that's right. I mean, one of Abbott and Costello's most beloved routines is "Who's on first."
Yeah, yeah, that's what I automatically think of for sure.
That's a if people know them at all, it's because of that. And when you think about it, the entire conceit of Who's on First is ridiculous because you're
Yeah.
asking the audience to buy that a team would have these people with these kinds of names, right? I mean, it's preposterous because those are nobody has those names. But
Right.
at no point are you thinking that while you're watching them perform the routine
Mhm.
because
Something about the pacing, yeah.
I mean, right? It's just the up, and and the nonsense of it is the point.
Right.
Uh, it, you
Yeah.
know, back in the day, Jerry Seinfeld hosted a special on NBC. This is when Seinfeld was on, where he was, talking about his love for Abbott and Costello, and that might seem like a strange thread to draw, but I think that's the appeal of it's absolutely apolitical. Um, it's rooted in things that are just about making you laugh.
Yeah. That's such an interesting connection. I was gonna say too that I think the humor resonates with me because that's my kind of humor where it's I mean, there's they do a lot of big things. Some of it's kind of slapsticky. I mean, it's older comedy, but at the
Mhm.
same time, it's like really dry. Like a lot of it is just like they're arguing back and forth. And I like that kind of humor anyway. So I think it
Right.
translates well to today because even though they do use a lot of like pop culture references, the core of what's funny isn't that. It's like just them commenting on the situation that they're in. Like you said,
That's right.
you don't get lost in like the details.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, was are there any other actors or parts about this film that we haven't kind of touched on yet? It's only like 82 minutes, so I didn't realize it was that short until I watched it. But it's a
That's
comedy.
kind of nice, right? I didn't give you too much homework.
You didn't. It wasn't like a 3-hour movie or anything. Which no shade to anyone that's picked a 3-hour movie. We've talked about those too. So no shade.
It's good to balance it out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But what were you gonna say?
Um,
What
I,
else?
I was going to mention Vincent Price making a voice cameo at the very
Oh,
end.
Vincent Price. I love him so much.
Now, what's interesting to me about my memory of watching this movie for the first time um, was I had never seen Vincent Price in anything,
Oh, really?
but when at that
At the time,
point
yeah,
when I knew who he was, because he was in the '80s. He was kind of like a pop culture presence, right? So
for
he
sure.
had been in, an animated version was in, Scooby Doo or whatever. But the movie ends, or it's coming to the end. We hear Price's voice, and I tell my brother, I'm like, "That's Vincent Price." I have no explanation for
Unmistakably, yeah.
that. I have no idea why I would have known that, but that's definitely a thing that happened.
Oh, so you knew it the first time you heard him, you're saying?
But I had no reason to be able to know that because I
You
had
sure you
never
didn't
been
see,
exposed to
like,
Vincent.
the Michael Jackson video, Thriller, or
Nope, hadn't. I saw that later.
Interesting, wow.
Isn't that weird?
Well, he's got a very distinctive voice,
Yeah,
and, like, a distinctive presence, like, in everything that he's in, like, I think that's why I like him so much as an actor, like, I feel like his, like I don't know, I don't wanna call it, like, overacting, but his style is so interesting and so fun and so big that it's just cool, but, like, I always
I
think of
love.
him or go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say I love. To your point, I love Bill Hader's impression of him on
Oh
SNL.
my
It was
god.
so
Every
funny.
Halloween when he used to
Yeah.
do that, yes. I'm trying to think of the first time I saw Vincent Price. I mean, probably for me, the first thing that I learned who he was because on Sesame Street there was a character named Vincent Twice.
Okay.
And he would say his name, he would be like, "I'm Vincent Twice, Vincent Twice," and like that. That was my
So
first
funny.
thing, and then of course he was in Edward Scissorhands. I think
That's
that
right.
was like his last performance,
That
and
was his last thing. Yeah.
yeah, and then again like the voice in the Thriller music video, and
Hmm.
probably like House on Haunted Hill and stuff like that. But I remember like the first time I saw the movie, The Last Man on Earth. Um,
Right.
I just really loved his performance, but like I was describing the movie to someone that hadn't seen it, and I'm like, it's kind of funny to me a little bit too. Like really respect him, but it's also kind of funny because in that movie, I feel like he's just like running around yelling like I'm the last man on earth and his like really over the top delivery, and it just like that's how I think of him, and I don't know, it's just fun. But yeah, I think that's why you somehow knew. I think his presence just like I don't know, broadcasted itself
Yeah.
to you and you just, like, didn't
It's
even need to
it's
see it.
it's so
Yeah.
weird how that, but I have such a distinctive memory of saying that to my brother, like, "Oh, that's Vincent Price's voice." Like, why would I know that?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like him also because, it was probably, like, 10 years ago, my husband and I bought from, like, Walmart. It was, like, I don't know, like, 20 horror films in, like, one little set, and it was really cheap. It
Hmm.
was, like, in a bargain bin, but it was, like, a ton of films from, like, the 40s and 50s, and we watched, like, a bunch of them, and he was obviously in a ton of them, so it was really fun. That was
I feel like he kind of fell into that Lugosi
Yeah.
space where he kind of had to crank out a bunch of low budget stuff because he was so typecast into that genre.
Yeah, I'm not say I don't say this as an insult, but it's almost like what happened to Nick Cage a little bit, like
Sure. Yeah. No.
and it's like but in some ways that makes him even more endearing to me, so I
Yeah.
don't know.
I mean, I mean, this is something that so many of these horror actors went through, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Christopher Lee spent basically the '80s and '90s not doing anything,
Mhm.
and and then Lord of the Rings sort of put him back in front of the public eye, and he was in Star Wars, etc. And by the time he died, I think he realized how loved he was,
Yeah. It's kinda like
and
what Star Trek actors go through, honestly, or Star
yeah,
Wars.
totally,
I was
totally,
at a
like
Yeah, go ahead.
I was no. It's like there's this dip where they can't find work, and then all the people who grew up with their work give them they have a chance to work with them.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I was at a con like a month ago, and John Delancey was there and Gates McFadden, and somebody came up and said, asked John Delancey, they're like, "Hey, so, I noticed that in your career, like, do you feel like Star Trek ruined it because you did a lot of like smaller, less important roles after that, or something like that blunt. It was like pretty
Ugh,
brutal." And
yeah.
John Delancey was quiet for a minute and he just said, I got a lot of work because of Star Trek, and I lost a lot of work. I mean, that's just kind of
Wow.
the nature of it, and I feel like that's changed a little bit these days. Like, I don't think actors get quite as typecast as they used to. Like, for some reason, we just accept them in more roles than we used to, but, that was definitely a thing, and you can see how, like, the horror genre was definitely that for a long time, what later I think
Yeah.
happened to the sci-fi genre.
I mean, I think that I think honestly, what helps is having the convention circuit also,
Mhm. Yeah, that's
um,
true.
be- because it keeps them out there. I've seen interviews with Dominic Keating from Star Trek Enterprise where he's like, pe- people come and they bring their kids, and I'm like, hey, keep them coming. Like
Yeah, like, it's
if
part of
nothing
the
else,
job,
he'll
part of the
always have
hustle.
that convention.
That's true. I know, and I have so many fond memories of that, of just going to conventions and meeting some of these people, so, um, I love my tangents, but I just had to mention that too.
No, it's a good tangent.
Yeah, it's kind of connected.
I
Um,
yeah, speaking of conventions, the last time I went to a convention was like fall of '09, or excuse me, fall of 19. Sorry,
oh, I was like, "Oh, my," that's, like, a
not
long
'09,
time ago.
19. The nice thing is I'm able to go as press, so I'm able to dodge a lot of the lines and stuff, which is um, I'm hopelessly spoiled now because
Yeah,
of
that
that.
is really nice 'cause,
It,
there's some lines,
it
let me tell you.
it's brutal.
Mm.
But I met Anson Mount, who
Oh, awesome. Oh,
he
yeah, I
had
saw your post.
you saw, yeah, he had played Captain Pike by then, but the new series had not
Mhm.
started. So there was no line at all, really. I mean, he was just chilling, um, which made it a great opportunity to just chat with him. But more importantly, he was so nice to my kids, and
Aw,
and
that's
they'll
awesome.
always remember that. They'll always remember like Captain Pike was just like chilling with us.
Yeah, I'm always, like, defending that because I remember I had a friend one time that watched the documentary with Conan O'Brien, when he was kind of it was, like, right after he had lost the show,
Hmm.
and he was doing kind of, like, a tour and meeting a ton of fans, and my friend was like, "Oh, that's so horrible, like, he has to, like, spend all this time with those fans, and they exhaust him, and there's these long lines, and they treat him like a product," and I was kinda like, "Oh my god," like, that was horrifying to me because I love going to conventions and stuff. And I told her, I was like, "I don't know, there's, like, another side I think that you just haven't seen, where
Hmm.
I think that I mean, it is part of the job for some of them, like, that's part of
Hmm.
what they do, but also I've got so many great memories, where I feel like the actors really enjoyed the interactions, and it wasn't like that. I mean, I guess I've had a couple bad ones, but honestly, they've been way more good than bad, and yeah, I don't know, I reject that. I think that it's been a really good thing, and then, like you
Yeah,
said, it helps
I think
keep them in the pop culture consciousness so that they get more work too, so
I think so. I mean, I think that if you're an actor and you know you have an opportunity, and you hope that you're working and you have other opportunities, but the idea of like you go to this thing for a weekend, you get to hang out with your own friends because your colleagues are there too,
oh, yeah.
and you get to have people come up and chat with you about how much they like your work. I mean, that's got to be kind of a nice feeling.
Yeah, why can't they have that for me? No. But, yeah, it's that's something that everybody gets, like you said. Usually, you don't get a bunch of people lining up to thank you, so and then you get paid for it, so it's not all bad. Um,
No,
but yeah, yeah. Well, was there anything else with the film that we haven't touched on yet? I wanna
I
make sure we
I
get all
think
the
we
bases.
covered all the bases and then some.
Yeah, I think so. We ventured off into fan territory in a positive way, which is hard to do these days. So, yeah. Well, Zaki, thank you so much for coming back and picking this film. Like I said, I really appreciate your show and wanted to give you an opportunity to share. Like, where can people find it?
Well, you can look for the Movie Film Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And the Nostalgia Theater Show is a spin off show of that, which has been on hiatus for a little bit, but I'm hoping to bring that back in the new year. However, there is a big archive of interviews I've done for that show that is out there. And that's each episode I talk to an actor or writer or director or producer about some pop culture artifact that they were involved in, and we go in depth. So I've talked with Patrick Duffy about Dallas and Mike Farrell about MASH. I talked to James Mangold about Ford versus Ferrari, and Fief Sutton, who produced Cheers, and Steven Weber about Wings, etc. And I truly, uh, I love the many different conversations I've been able to have on that show. So I hope people check that out. And you can also find my reviews and other commentary pieces at the San Francisco Chronicle, and that's sfchronicle.com. Actually, as we're recording this, I just received confirmation that I'm going to be chatting with Warwick Davis about
Oh,
the revival of
nice.
Willow. So
Awesome.
that's that's coming very soon. So
Man, my husband will love that. Well, thank you again so much for coming on and hope to have you back soon.
thanks so much, Lisa. I appreciate it.